Welcome to another edition of the Mael Time Podcast. I'm joined today by friend and author Josh Hammer. He's out with a brand new book, Israel and Civilization. The reviews are fantastic. If you just look at this blurb, I picked it up today at Barnes & Noble. It'd be tough to find better endorsements in the conservative circle. Josh, thanks for joining. I really appreciate you taking the time here.
Daniel, you're one of the people I've known the very longest in the general pro-Jewish, pro-Israel space. It's great to reconnect with you here.
Thanks so much for your time here. I want to start with not particularly a uniquely Jewish issue, although it does affect the state of Israel and it does affect foreign policy, with Jeffrey Goldberg's article that came out yesterday when he was accidentally added to a Signal chat with Mike Waltz and the Vice President of the United States and Pete Hegseth, amongst other people. What's your take on it from a legal perspective?
So it's astonishing. I mean, it's an absolutely appalling breach. That's where we have to start. I mean, the fact that this happened, that you and I are talking about it, that I record an episode of my own show talking about it there, the fact that we're all talking about this is just horrific. And the very first thing to say is that this obviously never in a million years should have happened. And we need to figure out exactly what led to this possibly happening. So the theory of the case right now seems to be that someone confused Jeffrey Goldberg for the U.S. Trade Representative Jamison Greer, probably because for the viewers here who have used Signal before, sometimes the name comes up as an initial, JG. That's not an excuse. I mean, that's the likely explanation. It's not an excuse. So it's absolutely appalling that this happened. Jeffrey Goldberg happens to be a very bad faith actor, by the way. This is someone who blocked me on Twitter literally a decade ago for criticizing him for basically laundering Barack Obama's nuclear deal to a skeptical public there. He's basically a professional left-wing activist, and if he were an intellectually honest journalist, he would have just left this group chat. He potentially would have said, guys, I'm here by mistake. I'm just going to exit stage right and get the heck out of here. So he is definitely partially to blame, maybe even largely to blame, but you have to get to the bottom of the incompetence here that led to this in the first place. The good news, here's the good news. The good news is twofold. One is that this happened very early on in the Trump administration. This had happened a year and a half from now, I would have been a lot more worried. The fact that it happened so early on leads me to believe that they could hopefully learn from this mistake moving forward, because there's still most of this administration left to actually do. The second thing that I think is important and also a bit of a white pill and is propitious, frankly, for the next few years or so, is that the anti-Houthi policy won here, and was something of a consensus, some of J.D. Vance's comments seemingly notwithstanding, but Pete Hegseth, Mike Waltz there, they were basically all in for combating the Houthis there, and that happens to be President Trump's policy. You know, Daniel, there's a lot of people that are trying to claim the mantle of MAGA or America First, and they're trying to make it out to be this Ron Paul, Father Coughlin style isolationism. But Donald Trump's actual foreign policy, when you look at it, is a foreign policy of peace through strength, and we see that yet again here when it comes to the issue of the Houthis.
I want to push back on one thing, though, when you talk about Jeffrey Goldberg in particular. And I saw Donald Trump Jr. tweeted out kind of attacking Jeffrey Goldberg and saying that he, like you said, is a Democrat activist, which I wouldn't disagree with, and I'm not defending Jeffrey Goldberg at all. But I think we can agree that if the roles had been reversed, and if there was a right-leaning website that was added to a Biden administration chat on Signal or something like that, undoubtedly it would have been, manna from heaven for Fox News and for everyone else, and it would have been Hillary emails times 28. At least. Roger Ailes in his grave is regretting that he didn't have a chance to run stories about this issue. So how do you balance the legitimate news story with some would argue, the foreign policy of the country and trying to be supportive as an American?
Yeah, I mean, this is harmful to the country, right? I mean, the fact that these deliberations that clearly were internal and meant to be internal are now exposed to the world. I mean, now everyone from Xi Jinping to Vladimir Putin to the Ayatollah and so forth can actually see how in real time the United States foreign policy decisions.
I also want to jump in there. Is that someone pointed out? I believe it was I can't recall his name, but from the Wall Street Journal, saying that Steve Witkoff was actually in Russia while he's participating in that group chat. He was in Russia on March 13th. So just from a security perspective, who knows what's going on?
Right. So there are definitely questions about whether or not Signal was ever appropriate. It probably is not appropriate. I'm sure that there are doubly, triply, quadruply secured, massively encrypted, government-specific messaging devices and apps. Having said that, Daniel, I'm not surprised. I know a lot of people in Congress and the executive branch. Basically, everyone uses Signal, so I'm not surprised that they were doing it. I'm not defending it, but I'm not surprised. To me, the more troubling part again is that Jeffrey Goldberg finds his way into this chat and that these messages end up getting exposed to the world. Now, I guess it's true that we should be thankful to an extent that Mr. Goldberg did not leak these messages prior to the actual attack on the Houthis. That would have been borderline treasonous behavior, actually.
Anti did self-censor to a point, right? He didn't say everything. He as he was clear yesterday, he went on television and was saying that he omitted certain things, like there's a name of a CIA operative, I believe, and there's other people, and he didn't include that. So it's not as if he just ran and said, "Well, guys, look what's going on."
Yeah, this is not the Pentagon Papers 2.0. Okay, so this is a slightly different situation there, and it's a major embarrassment, egg on the face of the Trump administration and Mike Waltz and all that for sure. It definitely could have been worse. So I suppose credit where credit is due. But to your point, if the roles were reversed there, I had the same answer. That I'm not going to say that every Breitbart reporter, whatever, wouldn't have scooped this up. I think many probably would. But if you care about OPSEC, if you care about operational security, if you care about the national security of the country, if you care about safeguarding how these very important internal deliberations are made, I don't care what side of the spectrum you're on there. I think you do have an ethical obligation to safeguard this stuff and make sure it doesn't see the light of day. So to a very large extent, I still do fault Jeffrey Goldberg.
Understandable. I'll just say this: I think many journalists, if you look after what happened with Hassan Nasrallah and the bombing in Lebanon, you have people like Ronan Bergman and other journalists that they're working their sources night and day to try to figure out exactly what happened, what were the deliberations, and they're doing everything they can to try to have someone leak this information to them. So, from a journalist perspective, I'm not saying that Jeffrey Goldberg is without fault, but I do understand where the legitimate news story aspect of it plays in, and I always get concerned when there's something that was a huge talking point for the conservative movement and Hillary Clinton's lack of concern about emails. And this is not to say that they're analogous. Hillary Clinton knowingly did something and intentionally did something, and then they putting bleach on the server. It's very different than accidentally adding someone. But that said, they did go on Signal, and there are legitimate concerns about that that can't just be ignored. And the fact that Jeffrey Goldberg is not a great friend of the Republican Party, or I would argue the interests of the American people, does not mean that the other stuff is necessarily excusable. And I hope that the conservative movement doesn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater when we deal with that serious issue.
Well, I can only speak for myself, but I've been very critical of the Trump administration for putting themselves in this position. This is catastrophic incompetence, and someone's head, proverbially speaking, is going to have to roll. I don't think it should be Mike Waltz, but maybe someone more junior than that, a staffer. Someone is going to have to pay some sort of price for the mere fact that this happened. It's not Jeffrey Goldberg's fault that he ended up in this Signal group chat. It is his fault, I think, for not acting ethically to the extent to which he should have acted after that. But it's clearly not his own fault that he ended up in here. It is someone else's fault, and there's going to have to be some repercussions there. Ultimately, as I said, thank goodness this happened earlier on in the Trump administration years. There's a lot of Trump administration left to go there, and if they learn from these mistakes, which hopefully we'll see play out in the next few days, next few weeks, if they learn from this, and that could be a very important lesson moving forward.
We're short on time. I just want to get to your book here. Tell the viewers what's going on here and what inspired you to write the book.
Israel and Civilization: The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Daniel, first of all, let me thank you for having me on to talk about it. The book has been selling like wildfire. It's absolutely crazy. It reached a number high of number 3 on all of Amazon.com last week. It literally sold out on Amazon the morning of publication day. To be clear, you can still order it there. You'll get your copy ASAP. The book's a bit different, Daniel, than a lot of other typical quote-unquote pro-Israel books. The very first thing the viewers here will know when you held up the book, they'll see that the cover is not this blue and white Star of David iconography. It's actually an early 19th century painting of Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea. And that kind of gets to what the book is actually about, really, is that this is a book partially about the contemporary state of Israel and U.S.-Israel relations. There are chapters on that. But it's operating at a slightly more theoretical and I would argue personally more important level, which is that this book is a post-October 7th book that is really trying to defend not just the state of Israel, but the children of Israel, B'nai Israel, the Jewish people. This book is a defense of the Jewish people and their role in the history of Western civilization, and really ultimately saying that without the Jewish people's greatest gift to the world, which is the Bible, which is actually God's revelation to Moses and the Israelites at Mount Sinai, and all that flows from that. Without that, we are nothing. Without that, we have no quote-unquote Western civilization that we speak of today. We hear from a lot of people that say Western civilization is at a crossroads. I totally agree with that. I'm not downplaying that at all. I accept the premise, but Daniel, I'm also a lawyer. I like to define terms. What is Western civilization here? Well, let's be very clear about that. Western civilization, to me, really is largely synonymous with this intergenerational biblical inheritance literally going back to Mount Sinai. And in multiple chapters in this book, I painstakingly attempt to demonstrate that so much of what we take for granted today when it comes to our day-to-day our day-to-day norms, like the golden rule, treat others as you wish to be treated, things like morality, ethics, law, politics, American constitutional structure, the notion that a president is not above the law. That's right from the book of Deuteronomy here. I mean, there's so much that we actually get from the Hebrew Bible there. And the book, Daniel, ultimately calls for an ecumenical Jewish-Christian joint biblical restoration project for Jews and Christians to stand shoulder to shoulder like never before and to engage in the joint, difficult but necessary work of biblical restoration, because without recovering those biblical values there, we ultimately are not going to have the confidence and the spine and the self-assurance to turn back the tide against the very real threats that threaten to engulf us all.
I think the audience is well aware of the threat from the left when it comes to fighting Jewish role in Western civilization and what the Torah and what Judaism has to offer. I want to discuss with you the threat from the right. You see a lot of emphasis from certain corners. You had Ian Carroll and Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, if you want to consider her from the right, trying to essentially blame the Jews for a lot of the ills in society. How does this book speak to the people who might be attracted to their podcasts and their feeds?
Well, Daniel, the exact people that you're talking about, these younger people in particular, really above all, probably younger Christians, people in their teens, 20s, maybe early 30s, who maybe they go to church once every few weeks or so. People who hear something from Tucker or Candace or whatever, and they're inclined to go down that path, they are maybe the number one most important audience for this book. To be clear, I have a whole chapter for the Jews. The Jews are a very important audience here. But in many ways, this book, above all, is arguably even more intended for Christians, which is why I had people like Glenn Beck offer endorsements for the book and so forth there. And Daniel, some of these people on the right, some of them do so in the name of Christianity. Some of them don't. So, for example, there's this whole kind of strand of what in the book I call neo-Nietzschean sentiment on the right. There's basically this pagan nihilism. We're talking here about people like Andrew Tate and Tristan Tate, some pseudonymous online personalities like the guy who calls himself Bronze Age pervert. And, these guys are basically trying to resuscitate kind of ancient Greco-Roman pagan ideals, like trying to exalt human strength as kind of the greatest thing, this notion that a man should spread his seed far and wide, and that is what it means to be a real man there. These are not biblical values at all. These are the kind of things, I mean, we know from Ecclesiastes that there is nothing new under the sun. These ideas have been around for a very, very long time there. They ultimately end up in very toxic fashion once you start from the anti-biblical starting position of rejecting Genesis 1:27, B'Tselem Elohim, that God made man in his image, which I argue is the single foundational ethical imperative for all Western civilization. The other threat there does come from these people like Candace and Tucker, kind of the crowd that is putting out on social media that they like to tweet out Christ is king. They profess to do what they're doing in the name of their religion, and they seem to be motivated above all, as you say, to blame the Jews and really trying to drive a wedge between Christianity and Judaism there, and trying to convince young impressionable Christians that they can basically forsake the Jews, forsake Judaism, forsake the Jewish state, and everything will be okay. I mean, this is catastrophically misguided for more reasons than we have time to possibly discuss, but I'll give just a couple. One, First and foremost, where do these people think that Christianity comes from? Christianity obviously comes from Judaism. Anyone who has ever picked up a Christian Bible, what they call the Old Testament and the New Testament is actually, comparatively speaking, pretty small. Like most pages, even in a Christian Bible, are actually what they call the Old Testament, what for Jews is Tanakh, the actual Hebrew Bible. So we share an overwhelming inheritance there. Historically speaking, we see time and time again how anti-Semites have always understood that their actual end goal is not the Jews. They come for the Saturday people first and the Sunday people next. Karl Marx is one of my favorite examples. So Karl Marx has this infamously anti-Semitic essay called On the Jewish Question that he penned in the 1840s, a few years prior to the Communist Manifesto. He's mincing no words about the Jews. He abhors the Jews. One might even say that he's one of the most infamous self-hating Jews of the 19th century. But his end goal, Daniel, is not the Jews. His end goal is nothing less ambitious than the ultimate overturning of all of Western capitalism and all of Western Christendom, Christian civilization here. And ultimately, even just at a very practical, empirical level, I know Christians sometimes debate the theological importance of Genesis chapter 12, that God shall bless those who bless the Jews. For instance, we recently had Mike Huckabee at a Senate confirmation hearing. He's a well-known Christian Zionist who believes this. But my message is, whether you believe it or not, it doesn't actually matter as a theological matter, because empirically speaking, going back in human history, I literally cannot think of a single example, a single one, of a nation that has turned on the Jews, that has discriminated against Jews, that has oppressed the Jews, and has been better off for it. Here, there, and everywhere, anti-Semitism is always symptomatic of a broader societal or cultural or civilizational rot and decay. So I'm deeply concerned about what I see out there, not just as a Jew, not just as someone who goes to synagogue and kosher restaurants and whatnot there, but as an American, as someone who was born in this country, who was born Abraham Lincoln's birthday, who loves this country. I love America. This is my home there, and I don't want to see America go to ruins. So if you care about the fate of America, and by extension the fate of the West, you have to care about the fate of the Jews, because where the Jews flourish, society flourishes, and where the Jews are discriminated against, society is ultimately headed for ruin.
How do we counter the idea that they're trying to insert this kind of dual loyalty agenda? Because, for example, we were talking off air about this video that Tucker put out the other day, and he's regurgitating claims saying that Syria was just a normal place before Israel got involved, and people that are not, basically the only reason that you would be concerned about what's going on in the Middle East is that you are emotional and you are emoting, not thinking logically. How do you even counter that? Because I don't think that many of those kinds of people really care about the truth. They're just using it and manipulating it to push an agenda, and it's hard because you're sitting here saying, "Look at this pasuk, look at this verse," and I don't think they actually care.
No, you've identified properly a very real problem. So I'll give you an example. About a month and a half ago, I was at Princeton University for a Steamboat Institute debate against Dave Smith, who's this libertarian comedian. He's vehemently anti-Israel. And the debate is on YouTube. The audience can go watch it if you want to there. I brought law, facts, logic, history to this debate, which is what I do. I try to stick to that. Yeah. Yeah, I prepare, but I literally just wrote a book on this. I kind of know my stuff as well, right? So, Dave Smith shows up and basically just appeals to emotion. And for instance, he says, "Oh, Israel's committing genocide in Gaza." And I was like, well, actually, they're not. John Spencer of West Point has shown the statistics to be blah, blah, blah. So, I come back and he goes, well, just look at it. Like look at all the rubble. And I'm like,
no, but then they turn back and they say, but the Jewish people who are speaking up have dual loyalty. That's essentially what they're accusing of. So, like you said, they're actually using emotion and not actually concerned with the factual reality of what's going on. But then when it comes time to actually spread their message and talk, they're only using emotion.
Yeah, great point. And they're also just ignoring the obvious fact that the vast majority numerically of Israel supporters in America are not Jews, but are Christians there. So, you want to accuse evangelical Christians who go to a Baptist church of having dual loyalty? Good luck with that. That argument's not going to fly there. But I have a whole chapter in this book, Daniel. The book covers a lot of terrain, but I have a whole chapter in the book making the case for close-knit U.S.-Israel ties on explicitly realist foreign policy grounds. Dare I even say America first or MAGA foreign policy grounds. And, here's the grand irony, that a lot of these people, Tucker Carlson, Candace, Dave Smith, who I debated at Princeton, they like to pound their chest and they say, America first, ditch the Jews, ditch Israel. But the irony is that it's Mr. Foreign Policy Realist, Mr. MAGA, President Trump himself, who was by far the most pro-Israel, in many ways the most emphatically pro-Jewish president since the Jewish state was founded in 1948. That's not an irony. There's an actual reason for that. So I explain at great length in this chapter why foreign policy realism, aka doing what is best in the U.S. national interest, foreign policy realism properly construed totally 1000% militates in favor of Abraham Accords style diplomacy and very tight-knit Israel emboldening U.S.-Israel relations there. So if you're a realist who looks at the world stage and you say, let's not care too much about the Middle East, let's care about China. Okay, guess what? I actually largely agree with that. I'm someone who thinks that China is by far America's number one biggest threat this century. The relevant question then for the actual diplomats and the grand strategists is how do you focus on China while simultaneously securing the American interest in the very volatile part of the world that is the Middle East? And the elegant solution, which Donald Trump understands entirely, is that you embolden our allies to basically secure and patrol the region in a way that redounds to both of our interests there. That's the Abraham Accords. That's the realist case for U.S.-Israel relations in a nutshell. So, you don't have to be a quote-unquote dual loyalist or whatever these stupid slurs and anti-Semitic buzzwords, whatever. None of that matters here. All you have to do is have a sober, grounded view of foreign policy, which thank goodness the current administration has.
You're right about that, thank God. And I will just add that they always like to invoke foreign aid and military aid and assistance to Israel, and it really is in the American interest for that relationship. You can make a number of arguments why it would be in the Israeli interest to stop that partnership when it comes to foreign aid and foreign assistance being put into the American economy on behalf of Israel. There's, as you see here, with when it's lack of munitions, lack of equipment, whatever it might be, there are very well thought out, grounded reasons why Israel would not want to be dependent on only buying exclusively American aid. So it's just ironic because they invert everything, I would argue, from an anti-Semitic base. Josh, I really appreciate your time. I know it was a little bit short. We could talk for hours and hours, but I really want the audience just to hear from you and get your amazing expert opinion. For those of you who have not yet purchased the book, Israel and Civilization, The Fate of the Jewish Nation and the Destiny of the West. Josh Hammer, thank you.
Daniel, it's been fun. Thank you, my friend.